And here we are, the main event of the fifth Lewis Edwin Hahn lecture. I am Randy Oxshire. I am the co-director and co-founder of the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought, which sponsors this, co-sponsors it with the philosophy department at SIUC. I see our faithful chair down there, Ken Stickers. And also the founder of our feast is the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity. Lewis Hahn was a great servant of both the philosophy discipline, academia in general, especially East-West dialogue, but in many other capacities. I'm proud to say that I knew him and knew him well, and he is greatly missed, although his life was a very long and very productive one. And so we hold these lectures in his honor and memory. So what I'm going to do now is introduce the executive director of the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity. That's Corey McCall, who I see has dressed up since our last session and actually has somehow controlled the lighting in his setting so that he now looks like Rod Serling on the Twilight Zone.
Terrible overhead light is the only light I have in here. So
it really works. You should definitely do that with your students. In any case, I'll turn it over to Corey McCall to tell you about how this evening came to pass, since he organized the lecture series this time, and also to introduce our speaker.
Okay, thanks, Randy. I'm really grateful for all of your work, the technical, taking care of the Zoom links and everything else. Grateful for our speaker. Grateful that Lewis has agreed to give the Lewis Hahn lecture this evening. Grateful that everybody else is here to participate as well. If there was ever a speaker who really didn't need much of an introduction, Lewis Gordon is probably that speaker, but I'm going to do my best to at least give you a little bit of an introduction to Lewis's who Lewis is and Lewis's work. Although we got great introductions in the previous talks today as well. So Lewis Gordon is an Afro-Jewish philosopher, political thinker, educator, and musician. Plays the drums and other percussive instruments and piano. Has a PhD in philosophy from Yale University, and does amazing research in a wide variety of areas, including Africana philosophy, philosophy of existence, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, philosophy of culture, race and racism, aesthetics, philosophy of education, philosophy of science, and more. He's also a noted public intellectual. Probably I don't need to tell any of you this, but the best way to learn about Lewis's work is to seek out his YouTube talks or his podcasts or his writings in public forums, as well as his more philosophical work. He's professor and chair of the department at the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut, Storrs, where he also has multiple affiliations with other departments, including Judaic Studies, Caribbean and Latinx Studies, Asian and Asian American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Global Studies. He's had a host of visiting appointments at universities throughout the world, he's a noted researcher as well. We've talked in some depth about several of his works already. So I'm just going to talk a little bit to sort of conclude this introduction, because you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to Lewis, about what his forthcoming work. He's currently the co-editor of the series, the book series Global Critical Caribbean Thought, and the journal Philosophy and Global Affairs, honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, former president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and forthcoming works include on philosophy, decolonization, and race, fear of Black consciousness. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Lewis Gordon, who's going to be talking this evening about philosophical autobiography and living thought.
Figured for the Center for Creativity, we should begin with a little ancient sound. As we know, the primordial instruments, the drum. First music you heard was your mother's heartbeat. Also, before I begin formally, I just have to make a comment on an observation here. As I look at the screen, I see two children of Kenya right next to each other on my screen. There's the esteemed Ngugi wa Thiong'o. It's so wonderful to see you, Ngugi, and Feroz Manji. So the ancestors are speaking. Somehow you just happen to be next to each other on the screen. Ngugi and Feroz and I love to talk about those elements. And so I'll begin with Halito. And the reason I begin with Alito is because we're in the United States, and basically that's one of the few indigenous languages with which I'm most familiar. That's Choctaw for hello. Hotep, which is ancient East Africa. Shalom, you all are familiar with that one. Assalamu alaikum. And Ujambo, a little statement to everybody else who are familiar with Kiswahili. Buenas tardes. I will add there Matia Vanakam, just a little shout out to my Tamil ancestry. So I'm going to begin this talk first with a poem. The poems I'm going to mention are actually poems I've written. Some of you all know me as a philosopher, but many of you don't know I also write poetry. Ngugi writes poetry. Jaspal writes poetry, and I suspect many of you do so as well. The poem is called How Difficult It Must Be. How difficult it must be to bring light to the world, emanating love behind which stands loneliness. Do not despair. Physical distances can always be bridged by longings of the heart. Thank you, all of you who have taken the time this evening to join me, my colleagues, and everyone else as we meet through resources that question science, technology, and transform them into sociality. I often mention that although we have to be physically distant because of this illness, it doesn't mean we have to be socially distant if we understand what the social means. Because it is neoliberalism that would like us to think that the social is bad, because then we're isolated and we're vulnerable and easily exploited. I want to just acknowledge the ancestors. I did that with drums, but you know, it's been a difficult period. Not only there's so many people who've passed. Before this recording began, we had some conversation about my bout with COVID-19. And in the midst of it, there were people who were close to me who passed away. Additionally, I was commenting on what it means to say still here. And you could imagine, because I told a story that's not part of this recording, of what it is in the height of fevers to hallucinate and see long gone loved ones. And it struck me as I was getting better, because as that period of March was so horrific, every 10 to 15 minutes, you just heard ambulances going. And it made me, a lot of people don't get it, that each person who passed was the loss to an entire community. There's somebody who has to mute their mic. Anyway, as this went on and I thought about all those people who were lost, this is one of the things that really connect through to some of what we were talking about earlier. When Marilyn, Isam Sabat, Dwayne Tunstall, when they were speaking, because when we talk about the uniqueness of a human being and all forms of life, we're also bringing something to life that is not captured by talking about being. And that's something I thought about years ago. I wrote a paper for a journal that Marilyn edited for a while. And the simple title of the paper was Irreplaceability. From an external point of view, you can replace anything with anything else. We're just a conglomeration of atoms. We're just matter. Just replace it. But we know when we deal with the biography of a life, the uniqueness of love, the connectedness we have, we understand that part of loving is the judgment of irreplaceability. Right? To capture this point, I remember when my best friend was killed, and I was so happy that he visited me when I was hallucinating. I remembered when he died, and I was there after putting him in the ground, and I remember this friend of the family walked up and looked at me and said, "Don't worry, you'll have other friends." Now, she meant well, but the sorrow was about his irreplaceability. That's what I felt with my mother, and that's what I felt with my father. I felt with many friends. But it's also how I think about each of you as I look at you right now. And part of our ongoing journey on life's way leads to the realization at times. There are times I reflect, because many of you whom I've known for a long time, and some of you I've known for a short time, there are these moments where I'm caught with the realization, and this is connected to Jordan's talk earlier as we think about time, that there is a time when each of us will no longer be among, this world of ongoing communication with each other. And it's a shuddering, it's a horrible thought, but it's at that moment of having to shake that thought away of the loss of each of you that makes me realize that I love you. Well, some people, there's a long list, but I just thought in this moment I should just mention some names because they passed away over the past year. And one a little earlier, that's Samira Amin, Kamau Braithwaite, James Cone, Elijah Cummings, Sheila Grant. Sheila Grant was the secretary when I taught at Brown. And we were just a community that was so close together. Kwame Jiche from Ghana, Wilson Harris, Abiola Relish, Shirley Levy, a beloved relative, Alana Lockwood, Maria Lagones, John Mascalo, Minoa Ekidowen, who was also an administrator when I was at Brown. She's known more by her English name, Donna Edmonds Mitchell. She was Wampanoag. Richard Wayne Penniman, in other words, Little Richard, and Govantaramu Rocky, Jervan Taramu Rocky, or I just know him as Papa Rocky. And Papa Rocky was basically like an additional father because his son, Jean-Paul Rocky, is like a brother to me. Thanks also to Corey McCall, Randall Oxier, Marilyn Newsom Sabat, Dwayne Tunstall, and the community also at SIU. When I was asked to give this lecture, it was funny. I even hesitate to give it because what I heard from Corey was it's supposed to be a lecture about Louis Hahn. And it's interesting because at that moment, I wasn't thinking about the idea of me being honored. So I'm going on and on under the assumptions about Louis Hahn. And then as things went on and he asked for the other speakers, etc., I began to realize that although I want to talk about him, I didn't realize that there were people to talk about me. But in a way, that's perfect because what I have to talk about in talking about him connects to a lot of why we're meeting right now. And so I'll start first by just a little reflection for us to think through, okay? And the little reflection is the fact that we're meeting this way because of quarantining. quarantining. And one of the things that many of us don't realize when we talk about philosophy, because a lot of people see philosophy as standing away from dealing with the intensity of the present, is that philosophy has been talking about quarantining since there's been philosophy. In fact, the most famous allegory in philosophy is Plato's allegory of the cave. And this is about individuals who are quarantined on the ground. And one of them was able to get out and get outside to breathe. It is striking when we think about this allegory, because though even the word allegory from allos and agorain, it means to use another means to talk about outside, right? To bring things out in the open. And so the idea of philosophy as trying to transform us from a quarantine condition is something we could reflect upon, as much as philosophy in its history was also a battle against imprisonment. It's striking what has happened to philosophy when we have professional philosophers who would scoff at thinking and talking in this way, because ultimately they have lost sight that ultimately philosophy is a liberating activity. And so when we do talk about incarceration, when we do talk against police violence, there's nothing philosophically compromising in doing that. And it's no accident that when philosophy became complicit with colonialism and the philosophical anthropology it generated, racism, it's no accident that those were philosophers who valorized isolation, quarantining, and being away from others. So in a way, part of our tasks is also the decolonizing of philosophy. Now, one of the reasons why I was so happy to be talking in a context that honors Louis Hahn is because my relationship to him began when I was an undergraduate. Some of you know my story. I didn't plan to go to college. I was a jazz musician. I went into college so I could spend more time with my girlfriend. Now, this is an unusual situation when you think about a Black philosopher, and especially because I've known a lot for using my mind. And the truth of the matter, throughout my childhood, I always used my mind. I loved learning. I to this day, I remember the books my uncles would bring home. I remembered Marilyn talked about Husserl when she was 16. I remember my Rastafarian uncle bringing home Black liberation books with Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah, those individuals. But even earlier, one of the few times in my life where I stole things was a period in my life where I was locked and isolated in a rather abusive situation in the island of Jamaica, and survival depended upon being able to reach the world of others. And so when I was sent as a servant to the store, I saw books, but I had no money. So I stole them. And I had my little library under my bed until, of course, I was caught and was banned from going to those stores. But you could understand the kind of world we're talking about, the kind of mind we're talking about, the kind of person we're talking about, when the idea of reading, of writing, of engaging even fairy tales was a struggle for life. So if we come to Louis Hahn, when I was an undergraduate at Lehman College in the Lehman Scholars Program, I was still a very poor person. I would go to the library, and the library was doing something really cool. The library had book sales, and the book sales were a nickel a pound. So you could imagine, I went, I'll take this, I'll take that, I'll take this, I'll take that. And lo and behold, there was this whole section of books called the Library of Living Philosophers. Even listen to that title, Living Philosophers. So you could imagine the library, this library of living philosophers, okay? And this Library of Living Philosophers series was really profound. For me, it represents a lot more than what people think. Because you see, ordinary festschrifts, books to honor thinkers, usually somebody else write their biography, and people, you know, they're more like hagiography and people praise them. But the Library of Living Philosophers was different. First of all, the philosopher was asked to write in her or his words. A lot of people forget in that series they were women. An autobiography of their thought. Jamaica Kincaid talks about this. Even though it's called autobiography, Jamaica Kincaid points out that autobiography is less to tell, it focuses more on your life, your details. But these were different. These were how your life and your details connect to the unfolding of a thought. So they're really more like a memoir. In a way, to read those autobiographies was to get a glimpse into an autobiography of philosophy. And so, in effect, then, despite the things they may say when they talk about the details of their life, I found in my encounter with those philosophers, and many of them were very different from me. I mean, you know, the early ones, I mean, we're talking about people like Dewey, C.I. Lewis, you know, we're talking about people like Gabriel Marcel. Their lives were very different from mine. But I noticed something in which we connected. And I saw this particularly, it struck me when I read C.I. Lewis's, because C.I. Lewis recollected of being so poor that he couldn't afford to pay someone to bind his dissertation, but he had to submit it bound. So what he did was he poked holes in the side, took off his shoelace and tied it. And it struck me, wow, I didn't know that C.I. Lewis was Jamaican. Because there's this joke about creativity, and we see it all over the African continent and all over the global South, of what the poor, the dispossessed, have to do. And so although this was a very famous white philosopher teaching at Harvard, that by the point he's being honored, there was a point of humility in realizing that philosophy for him was also a form of ascent from the cave, from the prison, from quarantine. But one of the things that struck me about a lot of those texts was the beauty of what brought them to philosophy. Because you see, today we're used to talking about professional philosophers. And I often remind my students that most professional philosophers don't do philosophy. I know that's a shocking thing to say. But most professional philosophers are basically people who are trying to socialize themselves and reap the benefits of what it is to be part of a professional activity of recognition. A philosopher, however, is something much more. A philosopher as something much more is a person that is actually connected not only to wonder, but is actually genuinely moved by truth and the sensitivity of the suffering of others. So in that regard, it had me, I noticed something with a lot of those philosophers. And this is where I connected with many of them, even though I had no interest at the time in being a professional philosopher. And what that is I remember when I was a little boy in Jamaica, that was a time where, you know, there weren't as much light pollution. You could see just how packed with stars the sky is. And that moment of just lying on my back at night, looking up at those stars, occasioned wonder, because it reminded me, it made it clear to me, in fact, of how extraordinary it is that something so vast can be such that a child like me could actually look at and appreciate it. We often forget that we live in a speck of dust, in a cloud of dust, in a larger cloud of dust, in a universe and possible pluriverse. And so that experience of wonder that is something that, and I remember to this day, even as I speak, I remembered my lungs being full with a kind of being overtaken by the air of just breathing. It felt like I was breathing in the stars. And you could see that's no understatement as we live in an age in which everybody is living in peril of the thought of taking their last breath. So what Louis Hahn did in that Library of Living Philosophers was something extraordinary, and it's often overlooked. In my writings, I bring up a concept I call the theodicy of the text. And the theodicy of the text is basically this. When I was a graduate student, I remember when I would read the texts, whether they're by Kant or Hume or Hegel, I would read the text and I would see in these texts the vitriol, the hatred, the disdain of women and Black people and indigenous peoples. And I remembered when I would bring this up to my peers, they would immediately get defensive. They became like that old sitcom, Different Strokes. You know, the punchline from the Gary Coleman character was, "What you talking about, Willis?" And they would respond to me like, "What you talking about, Lewis?" And I would say, "Oh, that stuff's there." And they say, "No, it isn't." I say, "Yes, it is." "No, it isn't." And of course, we'd go march over and point to the text, and there it was. And they would look, and there were classic responses. One response was, "How come I didn't see that before?" Another response would be, "Well, it's not that important." Now, that's a disingenuous response, because we all know when you're dealing with a scholarly study of philosophy or any intellectual tradition, what they say matters. People can write whole dissertations on a sentence or a paragraph. And then there are those who would rationalize it away and say, that's not what they really mean. Now, the reason I call it theodicy of the text is because, you see, theodicy is how do you account for the existence of God in the presence of evil or injustice. And we already know the two classic responses. The first classic response is basically, who the hell are you to question God? Right? You're a finite creature. And another response is, well, in God's infinite wisdom, there's more going on, and God gave you free will, and many people screw it up. Now, what's crucial about the structure of that response is that that's a response that lets God off the hook. It's a response that basically says there's nothing wrong with God. There's something either wrong with you or the rest of humanity. But there's another element of this that my peers didn't understand. And what they didn't understand is that, you see, and this is connected to the conversation we were having about racism in this country and why we have difficulty talking about racism in this country and many other countries. They thought my bringing up the racism, misogyny, etc., was an effort to say, don't read those texts. In other words, they thought it was a call for erasure. What they didn't understand is that it would be absurd for a Black guy coming from the Bronx, born in Isle of Jamaica, a Black guy who is Jewish, Tamil, etc., to expect to read 17th, 18th, and 19th century European thinkers, and there'd be no misogyny or racism in their texts. That would just be absolutely naive. So what they didn't understand is the very fact that I started that study, that course of study, meant I already made a commitment actually to read those texts. You see what I'm saying? The real issue wasn't what I was finding. The real issue was what is going on with my peers that required them to sterilize those texts in order to read them. In other words, they were committing an act of theodicy by failing to address the humanity of the people who wrote those texts. Because I grew up, I know white people. I know these are white people. I've been coming out of school with several hundred white people with weapons in front of my school, yelling invectives at me. I've been attacked by white people. I know how brutal it can be. In fact, one of the things, I was in an interview recently for the Jewish Forward, in which I was mentioning to the journalists that what many people don't know about historians of slavery and historians of racism is that however brutal you may have heard the public discourse, it's nothing close to the reality. In fact, most people who study the history, go through the archival material of colonialism, racism, all right, they go through such trauma in that study that they almost all have to get therapy. In fact, Hilary Beckles told me a very powerful story that when he opened one of the books in the archives in Amsterdam, he noticed that they were covered with tears. Okay, but you could see now the Theodician problem, because for the historian or for the theorist or for the person who study that reality, to talk the truth, to do what philosophy is supposed to do, what history is supposed to do, what all disciplines to do, if they were to talk the truth, they face the charge of being unprofessional, of being sensationalist, of stoking the flames. And so there's already a socialization of the theodicy of the text in which the truth gets in the way of professionalization. The next thing that I'd like to bring up then is that you could already see that in getting the humanity of those thinkers into focus, what Louis Hahn was up to. Because I think that early acculturation into learning how to read a philosopher as a human being is a gift that he offered that some people overlook in those texts. The next concept I want to introduce, and those who have read my writing, this is not an introduction, is the concept that Jane Gordon and I developed called a pedagogical imperative. And the pedagogical imperative is basically this. I could summarize it this way. I remember, I have brought this up in other contexts. I remember I was in a debate with a Black conservative who was arguing you shouldn't have Black studies because it makes people angry. And I remember thinking, what's wrong with getting angry? You know, I mean, maybe you're angry because you understand it. However, what he didn't understand, and this is where the pedagogical imperative comes in, is you see, when I was teaching at Brown, for instance, there were people who, when I taught contemporary African philosophy, a lot of students came to the course and a lot of them got angry, but they weren't angry at me. What they were angry about was that there was all this philosophy that unless you put the word African or Black or feminist or woman before them, it's just erased through the presumption of universal generic philosophy. In other words, these students were angry because they actually wanted to learn philosophy, but what they were getting was a sanitized misrepresentation of reality in a discipline. You see? So that meant their anger was an anger emerging from the fact that they wanted to get educated. In other words, it's a healthy anger. It was the imperative to teach the truth, to teach people that philosophy is not something that just sprung up in a group of people in Athens 2,500 years ago, that all over the world, there were people thinking. And in fact, and then of course, when they go back to their other professors, and they would say, why aren't we learning this or that? The standard response, like the theodicy of the text, is, well, that's not my specialization. Now, here's the thing. This is not about specialization. This is about pursuing the issues in such a way that one actually brings to the forefront the voices that contribute to that debate. When I write, for instance, I look for who makes the arguments, the claims, etc. And when I look at the bibliographies of my books and my articles, there's never a shortage of women writers, Black writers, Asian writers, Indigenous writers. It's not that I go and decide I'm going to treat it like a smorgasbord and pick them up and just put them there, force them into it. No. It's just that humanity has contributed to the issues that challenge us. And doing it properly is to listen to what they and read what they have to offer. And so what's implicit then is that the response from those other professors should not have been, well, that's not my area, because that's not what the students are saying. Their response should be, because I want to know my area, I should continue learning. I should read those texts. You see? Because as we know, that's the effort they make with many European writers who are not in their area. And so this then brings me to another point, which is the idea of philosophical research. And it's not just philosophy, but any kind of research. I often begin classes with a conversation with my students about what a professor is. And my students usually offer their models. Often it's like Moses with the tablets. But what I usually bring forth is the idea of a professor as a person who fell in love with learning and continues to learn. All research really is, all philosophical inquiry really is our continuing to be students. It's just that it's, instead of having a person who functions as our professor, we have now learned to learn through continued learning. And that means that when the students enter the conversation, although they're beginning, because we don't have the exact or same experiences they have had, they're bringing that relationship to the learning. And so that means then we come to the last part, and this is something that was highlighted in Marilyn's talk, is that in effect, a teacher is a student. But part of what we do when we do political work, intellectual work, we were talking about philosophical inquiry as liberation practice. When we talk about what it is to be committed to revolution, to transform the world, we're also talking about the intellectual as a teacher. But when I say the intellectual as a teacher, I don't mean a didactic teacher. And so when we think about it as an ongoing student, that means then the activist intellectual is not a person who is trying to diminish the value of truth or knowledge. It's the person who is trying to engage with it in such a way that there is continued learning. In other words, revolutionary praxis is also a praxis of a community learning together. And so I bring this up because I want to bring up in the more immediate, a distinction between certain models of how people look at philosophy. And yeah, Michael, you have to hit the mute again. What dominates a lot of inquiry is what I call the agonal model, where to do theoretical or philosophical or intellectual work is to function like a warrior. It's agonal. Even the language of it is, how do you knock down another person's argument? Right? How do you fight? It's a fighting, it's a warrior view. But who says that should be what philosophy is? I mean, there are times you do have to fight, that's true. But there's another model, which is an effort to see what we failed to see before. And I've argued that that's the heart of the phenomenological model, but it doesn't have to be exclusively phenomenology. You see, the kind of reasoning through which a community learns together and is able to see together is the transformation of that agonal model into a meeting of what I call theoria and mythos. And it'll take a long time for me to get into the details of that, but I talk about this in some of my writings. I actually argue that it's false to say that philosophy is anti-myth. And that's because theory, which is at the heart of much of philosophy, works with metaphors of seeing. But the problem is, even if the stage is lit for you to see, if there's no meaning, then what you see is unintelligible. The world of myth is first and foremost a world of meaning. And in fact, what myth is about is what comes from the mouth, okay? So it's about narration. So if we come back to this question of philosophical autobiography, we begin to see that this has been going on for a long time. When I teach my classes, for instance, I start with a reflection on philosophy from an ancient African philosopher by the name of Antef. He wrote at about 1900 BCE, or approximately 4,000 years ago. Now already, I don't even have to get into the details there because my students would immediately see that his reflections were at least 1,400 years before the pre-Socratics. And as Antef wrote about philosophy, what was striking is he wrote about it in a philosophical autobiographical way. He talked about what motivates a philosopher. And it's not just him. If you think of another African philosopher, yes, an African philosopher, St. Augustine. Because St. Augustine of Hippo was, again, I mean, was a person who looked more like Feroz or me. Not like the way, you know, whenever people want to whitewash history, they make great thinkers of the past look like Santa Claus. So you see these pictures of St. Augustine looking like Santa Claus. But St. Augustine actually looked more like Myron or Feroz or me, okay? And then when we think of someone like Zara Yacob in Ethiopia, and again, Zara Yacob, the treatise of Zara Yacob, he did not just talk about ideas, but he talked about his relationship to the ideas. It was a form of philosophical autobiography. And this is something that continues all the way through to the present. Now, I bring this up also as a way of commending the people who organized this meeting. Because what some of you may not know was that the decision for this meeting preceded the events that transpired this past spring. As we know, with the atrocities that are going on, particularly not only against the protesters, but also what we saw with George Floyd and others, okay? A form of trying to respond to Blackness has become fashionable. There are people looking for Blackness every day. All these Black academics are talking about, boy, these publishers are looking for us. And a lot of people want us to say, give us something Black, give us something Black. Black, as they said in the movie Get Out, Black is in fashion. But this decision was not made under those circumstances, you see? So this was a decision that was already made in a way that goes full circle from what the namesake of this lecture was trying to do. In other words, it's not, oh, let's get a Black philosopher to speak. It is connected to the fact that the themes that we have heard, not only from Jordan, even though Jordan's was from a different lecture it connects through, but from Marilyn and from Dwayne, these are lectures about what it is to do living philosophy. And understanding that, it just created a situation where perhaps there were ancestors whispering in their ear, but it contextualized the situation for us to meet now where we can talk about those circumstances. Now, when I wrote Existentia Africana, which was published in 2000, there's a section in which I raised a point about autobiography that was very different from the kind that Louis Hahn and the kind that I just framed here. I pointed out that there's a kind of racism that treats Black people in such a way that one Black person constitutes all. And because one Black person could constitute all, quite often Black people are expected to write autobiographies. And at the time, there were autobiographies even being written by Black children, just to give you an idea. And the idea, the notion, was that ultimately there is a form of exponentiality in Blackness that would make any Black person writing an autobiographical statement the statement of all Black people, when in fact those people were talking about their Black people. However, there is a deeper philosophical problem to be met when we talk about autobiography. And that deeper problem is that autobiography requires talking about your experience. But one of the insights about experience, and that's what I pointed out in Existentia Africana, is that every one of us has the experience of trying to figure out our experience. In other words, experience in and of itself requires intelligibility. It requires bringing something to the experience. And in fact, when we often have experiences, we often go to somebody we trust or someone to talk to, whether it's a friend, our spouse, our, whoever it may be, our sibling. And we talk about it because we want to bring something to the experience that makes it intelligible, that makes it make sense. And that something is what is an interpretation, but it also is theory. And I'd argued in Existentia Africana that the importance of theory is such that blanket experience in and of itself is not necessarily liberatory. In other words, there's a liberation role for theory. And theory brings to the experience a form of understanding through which we can now communicate the intelligibility of political action. Now, some of these remarks I said about philosophy, and Dwayne did an excellent job of talking about it earlier, connects to what I call disciplinary decadence. And disciplinary decadence, and decadence, as we know, is linked to nihilism, but there's more than that. Disciplinary decadence is also a form of theodicy. And the theodicy is when we treat our discipline like a god. And if we treat our discipline like a god, then that which doesn't fit into our discipline functions like the external manifestation of evil. A good example, and this is what Du Bois noticed, is that the presumptions of human sciences in his day were such that if Black people didn't fit into those presumptions, the theorist, the scholar, the person engaged in research would not ask, what's wrong with my theory? What's wrong with my discipline? The response was, what is wrong with these people? And this is one of the problems many of us have when we approach the study of people whose humanity has been challenged. Because if they don't fit in the box, we treat them as something wrong with them. This is one of the reasons why, for instance, some of you may know, who already know who have read my writing, I've been writing in queer theory from the beginning, because there is a form of queerness in the human condition that is toward which there's an attempted erasure of an effort to de-queer us in practices such as ontology. So the theodician part tends to take two forms. Either we treat the discipline as ontologically basic. So this is where anthropologists criticize everybody else for not being anthropologists. Sociologists criticize you for not being sociologists, biologists for you not being biological or a natural scientist, mathematicians, et cetera. And the line goes on. And of course, for people who have a decadent view of philosophy, it's the same thing. There are some people who reduce philosophy to one of its subsets. Some people think if you don't do epistemology, you're not doing philosophy. One of the problems I have with Heidegger is the way he treats ontology. But the fact of the matter is that none of these are complete. And the same problem happens with analytical philosophy when logic is treated as a sine qua non of practice, because we treat it as methodologically complete. We in effect treat the methodological assumptions of the discipline as if they were created by a god. So the same problem is what I brought up with the Odyssey of the Text recurs in disciplinary decadence. And so when we think about this situation of disciplinary decadence, then, what disciplinary decadence does is not only treat the system as if the discipline as if it were created by a god, but it also creates a certain problem. Because once you treat it as if it's created by a god, you're now locked in a silo. You no longer have to go beyond the discipline in order to study. You treat the discipline as reality. Now, in order to get out of that, I argued for a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. And what a teleological suspension of disciplinarity means is the willingness to go beyond the ontologizing of one's discipline for the sake of reality. And this already brings up something very crucial. And you could see it a lot in Eastern thought, but it's in African thought, it's in indigenous American thought, And what that is the realization that reality and being are not identical. And so if one is going to commit a teleological suspension of philosophy, it means you're willing to go beyond philosophy for the sake of reality. Now, of course, there's a paradox, because in doing so, you may produce new kinds of philosophy, new kinds of thinking. But the crucial thing is for you not to worry about whether it's philosophy or not. Because, as I often have to remind people, philosophy doesn't have the answer to everything. So this means then we're dealing with the question, when we deal with a teleological suspension of disciplinarity and teleological suspension of philosophy, in that sense, this is part of what Marilyn was talking about earlier when she talked about phenomenology. Because paradoxically, phenomenology has to not fetishize phenomenology in order to de-ontologize phenomenology. In other words, that reach for reality means reaching beyond itself. Now, this is a meta-philosophical point, but it extends into a variety of issues that I've talked about over the years. And I hope, and I'm glad to see for many people that they've been useful. In fact, what's really funny, one of my happiest moments was one time there was a Facebook exchange going on and they were really fierce in the debate. And somebody intervened, and I was talking to somebody else and told me that I should think about the concept of disciplinary decadence. And then somebody else wrote in, he was the one who formulated it. And for me, that's actually healthy, because it meant the idea went beyond the thinker. You see what I'm saying? A really useful idea, it doesn't matter who thought it up. Right? In other words, that person was approaching the way I approach when I write. The main point is for the idea to work. And it's funny when people fetishize ideas, because that point I made earlier, a lot of people don't even know that some of the men they study in history were historically women, but rewritten as men. There are people who are rewritten as as white, who were black. But it's just that in their time, they had no reason to call themselves black. They were just human. St. Augustine was an example, okay? So as we begin to think about this, what I argued is that, and this is now, I'm going to just move a little quickly because I know we've had a long day, that there are several kinds of problems that are generated from thinking in this way. And this is a way of thinking outside of binary systems. It's a way of thinking non-reductively. And what I just basically argue is that in the Euro-modern world, it problematizes certain questions. One of them is the question of our humanity. Just at the bottom line is, we can say all kinds of things about it. At the end of the day, racism involves looking at a group of human beings and saying they're not really human beings. And what's funny, what's striking about it is it's really weird that you have to find a human being to tell the human being that she or he is not a human being. That's the performative contradiction. The very act of racism is actually an acknowledgement that it's a human being you're saying is not a human being. And then there's the question of freedom. And the question of freedom is related to the point at which I talked about reality versus being. Because although there are many debates going back to Parmenides and Heraclitus and many others, the bottom line is that existence places the human being as a divergence from being. And that brings the upsurge of the question of responsibility for that relationship. And that is freedom. And then finally, the challenges of the Euro-modern world, the problem we have is that a whole lot of rationality, a whole lot of science was used to rationalize dehumanization and unfreedom. This, I argue, created a legitimation crisis of reason and rationality. In short, even justification was in need of justification. And that is one of the reasons, that's one of the things that drew me to phenomenology. And this is not to valorize. My claim is not phenomenology is the only way to do this. And that is not, it's not that it's the only answer. But one of the striking things about phenomenological practice is the realization that justification is in need of justification. And how you do this in a non-circular way becomes the task. Now, a lot of my work has been devoted to that, but to get into that detail would take up too much time. I just for now want to put it on the table to point out that reality as transcending being raises the problem of freedom. Now, thought and freedom carry responsibility, and in my writings, I argue they're linked to love. Now, again, there are many ways I could talk about this, but I'm just going to give a very short summary of a paper I gave on Mary Shelley and Frantz Fanon. Because, I mean, given my position about how to approach teaching philosophy, you could imagine why I've taught Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in so many courses and in philosophy courses. Because it's an extraordinary text that was written by that 19-year-old girl, but woman as well. Because she raised a question, and it's connected a lot to Jordan's talk earlier, the question of creation, you see? Because Victor Frankenstein, and the name Victor, you already know, means victory, and Francus means freedom, victory over freedom, or freedom's victory. Victor Frankenstein thought he could be free if he could conquer life. But what he ended up doing when he created the creature, again related to the word creation, was he eschewed the creature because what he was trying to produce came out of narcissistic models of love. In other words, he was not trying to create, he was trying to reproduce. And that mimetic effort is narcissistic model of love. Now, Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask also explored that issue when he talked about the black as a white construction, and he talked about the human sciences, he talked about problems of failure, etc. And as many of you know, because many of you have read Black Skin, White Mask, he ended the book with a prayer and a question. And that very question of possibility was because Fanon in that book was working from the premise of the notion of the I. In other words, it became all about how I individually can be liberated. And in fact, from Dwayne's talk, this is the problem with a lot of the Afro-pessimists, because they're looking at the issues, and it's no accident that a lot of them are actually petty bourgeois and etc., about getting theirs. It's all about theirs. And they make their individual condition a supposed black condition. But what Fanon realized by the time he wrote Le Damné de la Terre, and in between he wrote a lot of other works, is that that first model, which is based a lot like Frankenstein, which is the idea that the black is just a projection of white recognition, that is what needs to be abandoned. And in Le Damné de la Terre, the damned of the earth, you all know it as wretched of the earth, what Fanon realized was that this is the mistake done by the post-colonial bourgeoisie. That when they achieve independence, they actually want to reproduce the normative conditions of colonialism. And this is why in many post-colonies, although there's declared independence, the schools, the political systems, the religious systems, anything that has to do with power are simply mimetic reproductions of the colonial order. And so if one is to break from that, what Fanon realized is that one has to move into non-mimetic, non-narcissistic models of love. In other words, the project is not to take the place of the colonizer with the mechanisms of power that preceded that moment of independence. The task actually is to figure out how to let go of the colonizer and understand that the subsequent generations should not have to be like those who were engaged in the struggle of independence. Otherwise, what one would be locked in is an endless cycle of rationalization, legitimation through the effort of the ongoing violence of separation from the colonial order. And so with that in mind then, the mistake that Fanon realized that Victor Frankenstein had, he never talked about in terms of Victor Frankenstein, but I'm saying that, is that what Victor needed to do was not to look for himself in the creature. His task was to love the creature as the creature. He had to embrace him and gave him the opportunity to grow as a new kind of reality in the world. But because he shunned him for not being the reproduction of the self, and we're seeing this happening right now, because as we deal with neoliberalism and neoconservatism, it is ultimately an effort to try to lock all life on this planet into the normative mechanisms of the 18th and 19th century. In other words, it is the ongoing coloniality of what is expected people to be. It treats the colonial order as permanent. But if we're going to be liberated from that, we have to understand that we have to let go also of models of the self that are premised upon reproduction. And that letting go is a form of radical love that leads to two additional questions. The first one is the question of value. And there's an essay I wrote called Reimagining Liberations, where I argue, and some of you have heard me speak about this before too, whenever I give the awards at the Caribbean Philosophical Association, I talk about this. I bring up the example that what makes revolutionaries is not ressentiment, it's not hatred, it's actually love. But it's love in the form of being able to value being valued by the dispossessed, the disadvantaged, the damned of the earth. See, the colonial order tells you you're of no value unless you're valued by the institutions of power and recognition from the colonial order. You're not a good professor unless you're a professor at Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge. You're not a good human being unless you're recognized by those who are billionaires and represent, institutions of power. But what made people like Frederick Douglass or Anthony Ephrem or Harriet Jacobs, or all the way through to people such as Sheikh Anta Diop, or right now, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, is that there is this understanding, that moment at which you understand being valued by those whom the hegemonic order tell you cannot be sources of value. That is a revolutionary act. Because at that moment, you're no longer locked into the reproduction of imposed being. You're now in the communicative, transformative, transdisciplinary, loving practice of possibility. And this means now you face the future in a way that's different from what dominates Euromodern Western philosophy. Because Euromodern Western philosophy fetishizes epistemology precisely because it wants to control the future. There are models of knowledge that are premised upon control. But there's something provocative of saying, I want to build a future that I know that I don't control. That ultimately, the people who are to inherit it are the people who are going to build new forms of meaning and value. That is radical democracy. It's the understanding, it's that moment of saying that the future isn't about me. It's about my love for the freedom of those who don't have to be like me. And that kind of radical freedom means it raises the existential question, how then can I act? And I often bring up examples like Harriet Bailey, Frederick Douglass's mother, or the many Black women, or the Dalit woman, or we could go through a long list of people under colonial conditions who faced a world that told them their actions will fail. It's impossible for them to succeed. Yet we know they acted. And the reason we know they acted is because we're here. Right now, in this forum, which has the word philosophy in it, look at the demographics of this Zoom meeting. It is here because of the political commitment of our ancestors who knew they were fighting for something greater than themselves. That meant they had to take the position that although they will never see the promised land, it was still worth fighting for. It's about commitment. You see, that's the problem the Afro-pessimists have. The attitude is, if I don't get my peace, then it's impossible. To which the response is, who the hell says it's about you? One of the greatest acts of love, and if we go back to that point about teaching, it's about those who transcend us, but at the same time, paradoxically, we relate to them. And so this means that if we bring it back to philosophy, decolonial practices of philosophy, decolonizing philosophy means letting go of the self. You'll see this in the writings not only of people such as Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo talks about this. You see it in Kaiji Nishitani. You'll see it all the way through to radical Black thinkers, not only Fanon, but you could also see it in some of the contemporary voices as we see people who face the challenges of what it is to say, I am committed to fighting for that which is greater than myself. And when we do that action, the only thing we could hope for, but we don't set as the condition, is that the generations that inherit that world for which we fight can look back at us and say thank you. There was no way for Louis Hahn to know that his efforts could lead to a form of a meeting, a gathering like this. In fact, those who knew him, this Texan, this West Texan, doing his stuff around creativity, they know he had no idea that it would lead to this. But the fact that he was raising the right question of humility in philosophy, of getting people to see thinkers, not as gods, but as human beings, set the condition for the ongoing communication and transformation of the human condition. And so I close with a poem that is actually the poem I use at the end of one of my books that's coming out next year. The book is called Fear of Black Consciousness. And if you want to know the thesis of Black consciousness, of that book, the fear of Black consciousness is the fear of truth. Because the reality is a whole lot of energy has been put in the history of Euromodernity to suppress the truth. And that truth is that Euromodern civilization is premised upon narcissism. It's premised upon the Victor Frankenstein model. And when the colonial subjects look back, they eschew it, they dominate it. It's a form of narcissistic rage against freedom. And as we understand that the fear of Black consciousness, the fight for freedom is a political fight. And it's a political fight because it takes power to disempower people, but it means it'll also take power to empower people to transform the world. And so I close that book, Fear of Black Consciousness, with this short tercet. Oh, how different our journey could be, whose life is also its undertaking, whose commitments are without idols. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gordon. Let me switch to Brady Bunch view, and I'm looking for questions and hands.
By the way, it's so great to see La Rose Paris is here, Abdul Jan Mohammed. There are so many people where it's just wonderful. Thank you so much for joining this meeting.
Since nobody's going, I'd like to.
Yes.
Louis, I think you have put me on track to answer a question that I've had for decades, probably almost 50 years, about Frankenstein. You started, I wrote down that you said something about responsibility for the relationship, and that is freedom. So I wanted to come back to that. But then you went on and began to put me on this track, because my question about Frankenstein all these years has been, why is there so much rhyme of the ancient mariner in Frankenstein? Then you went on, and here's where I began to get some ideas to think about. You said that Victor's task was to love the creature as the creature and to let go of models of the self centered on reproduction. Am I putting those things together in a way that makes sense?
Correct.
Thank you.
I see in the chat someone said, can you elaborate a bit more on Afro-pessimism? And that's from Googie to everyone. Well, earlier, Dwayne Tunstall had talked about some of the arguments made up from Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimism argues that Blackness is ontological, for instance. And the problem with it is that a lot of Afro-pessimist claims have the veneer of historicality, but are not historical. An example is, for instance, one of the claims is that Blackness was born in the Middle Passage from Africa. Now, if it were historically born, then how could it be ontological? What one could argue is that it's an effort to make Blackness ontological. And that's part of the problem, because humanity is actually a defiance of ontological constraints, because the human world is not actually a world of being, but a world of meaning. And so that's one of the claims, what's one of the big issues. There are other issues I have with Afro-pessimism. It is an intellectual movement. It is, but the other problem I have is you could see once that ontological move is made, it then moves into the Euromodern centering of epistemology. And so pessimism becomes the question, a form of will to power in which one, in being pessimistic, can say not be disappointed. But the problem with that is what they fail to see is that pessimism is just the other side of optimism. In other words, they're symbiotic relationships. And because they're symbiotic relationships, there is something that's missing in those models. And what's missing is what I concluded the talk with. And what I concluded the talk with is that political action is not about what you know. Political action is actually about what are you committed to. And that's the thing that people miss. All of those people who kept fighting and fighting from the moment they were dragged onto slave ships, from the moment they were in plantations, all those indigenous people who survived the Trail of Tears, all of those people, and it's not just them. I don't want to create this dichotomy of just heroic people of color. All of those white people who wanted to let go of whiteness because they saw it as getting in the way of humanness. All of those are manifestations of commitment. And the thing about political commitment, because political commitment is not about you, you don't say if it's about me, because political commitment transcends the self. And that means it's always about us, we, or something even broader than us and we, life. Because of that, political commitment transcends the optimism-pessimism divide, you see? And that's the part that's missing. So the big one, it's because of my argument for the importance of political praxis. That's one of the main reasons why I'm very critical of Afro-pessimism, although many of them build their work through misreadings of my work, because there's some of them who take my concept of an anti-Black world and translate it into the world is anti-Black. To which my response is, no, the world isn't anti-Black, but the reason it isn't is because there were people fighting against that achievement. There are people fighting for a world that transcends the idea of the ongoing practice of the dehumanization of our fellow human being. So thanks for the question, Gugi.
I can see that we've got a couple more questions lined up in the chat, and that seems to be working pretty well. So I'll tell you what, Louis, why don't you just
Read it?
go ahead with that? Yeah.
Okay, so
people probably feel more comfortable with that.
Sure. The next one is, can you comment further on identity politics and the individualization of identity? The first thing is, I have to say I'm against the formulation identity politics. It's a problematic notion. Its history is very complicated. It's one of the big problems we have today is that we often treat things as politics by simply putting the word politics next to them. And so, especially if it's going to be so individuated that you treat yourself like a god, by definition, you're outside of the social sphere of power. So in effect, then, that's not properly political. It's narcissistic or it's moralistic. And in fact, many claims, when you look at them, they're more moral identity claims. And that's because they work very well under the logic of liberalism. If you look at the distinction between what's called liberal political theory versus many other kinds, whether it's through ancient political philosophy or the way the political categories of political life are thought of in other parts of the world, liberal political theory is actually an effort to eradicate the political in political theory. It's ultimately based on the idea of a moral individual and the idea of bringing the moral subordination of politics into institutions of power. Now, the problem with that is not only does it collapse into moralism, and because of the moralism, the concern then becomes on the moral character or status of the individuals involved, but it also leads to that kind of reasoning that I was being critical of, the narcissistic model, because it becomes mimetic. It becomes an effort to say, what works is if you can be like me. And the issue, once that begins, the problem that follows with everybody else is that they're not like you. And then it leads to other kinds of problems. Another problem is the valorization of the notion that somewhere out there in the world, there's a group of people who got it right, whatever it is. But the moment you make them that way, they're no longer human beings. They no longer can make mistakes. They no longer have freedom. Part of being a human being also is to have the possibility of mistakes. In fact, one of the reasons I write a lot on bad faith is a lot of people miss the point about bad faith. A lot of people think it's about just not being in bad faith, but no. Bad faith has to be a possibility of our condition precisely because of freedom. If you're not free to attempt to evade your freedom, then what will happen is that you'll be just isomorphic with everything right, no matter what you do. And so the problem with the idea of trying to treat politics in terms of identity is that it sneaks in the door the undermining of politics as well. Because one of the things that's very discomforting, particularly in the liberal model, is that you can't have politics without power. But power is often not defined in those contexts. Power is about the ability to make things happen and having access to the conditions of doing so. And so if we understand it in that way, then for something to be political, it always means that you're dealing with something that transcends yourself. And that's why the political is always, always, always about us. And so the question, when I talk or I write about categories such as Black, etc., one of the things I didn't bring up is I make a distinction, for instance, between Black with a lowercase b and Black with an uppercase b. Black with a lowercase b is the kind of double consciousness Blackness that's simply a function of the identity imposed upon the people designated Black by an anti-Black society. However, once one realizes that one can never be simply black, female, queer, or any of those, that one can be multiple things, then one begins to realize that one has a form of responsibility that transcends that reduction. And once one begins to understand that, one begins to work through what it means to become an agent of history. And as an agent of history, that leads to the capital B, black. But that capital B, black, is paradoxical. Because you see, as an agent of history, what that capital B, black, is actually doing is not only challenging black melancholia, which is the idea that black subjectivity is as dictated by an anti-black society, but that person also begins to question the metaphysical presumptions of a complete blackness. That means that there may be possibilities through the commitment for liberation, for freedom, that would create, that require a form of power to be able to be involved in social transformative practices. And this is one of the reasons why in anti-black societies, there's such a fear of bringing the words black and power together. Because they think, they confuse power with domination. They think black power means black domination. But that's not what it means. Black power means the empowerment to be able to be engaged in the political activities of the society. And so if we understand black power that way, we also begin to realize that any form of power we're talking about that's going to function as empowering subsequent generations means that it has to let go of the idea of constraining and controlling the possibilities of how those generations may live. And so this is one of the reasons why you never hear me in my writings push the claim identity politics. There's identity moralism, there's identity rationalization, but I actually think that this effort of identity is an effort to impose being on political life. Jespal says, can you explain again what you mean by reality and meaning are not the same? No, I didn't say reality and meaning are not the same. I said reality and being are not the same, and meaning and being are not the same. That's what I was arguing. And one of the interesting things, one of the things I do appreciate, and this is interesting, this is where someone like Nishitani, someone like Aurobindo, and someone like Husserl meet. And it's also where in a lot of my work, there's meeting too. And that is what we realize, and Nishitani, I think, said it best. He says, being covers over reality. That's how he summarizes Western philosophy, as an obsession of covering reality with being. Because that means that at the heart of reality is the ongoing production and possibility of meaning. Reality is relational, in other words. And it's very interesting because if we look at, I mean, I'll pick Husserl as an example here because many of us are familiar with that text, but there are others who argue this. One of the things Husserl realized when he talked about evidentiality and when he talked about this moment, I call it ontological suspension. He called it, phenomenological reduction. But one of the interesting things when Husserl makes that move is that Husserl began to realize the exact argument that I just made against Victor Frankenstein. Because he realized that there's a seduction of the analogical self. In other words, the use of my ego as reproduced for the project of intersubjectivity. But if it's an analogical me, it's not intersubjective. It's a projection. And this is one of the reasons why the demand at that moment is to deal with the question of a real, not an ontological, but a real, which is a greater idea, other. And this is where people like Edith Stein and Levinas and others came in, because what they began to realize is that that moment of taking evidentiality and others seriously is a moment at which the seer, the thinker, the theorist, has now put herself or himself in the realm of accountability. In other words, there is an ethical dimension to all acts of evidencing. And this ethical dimension, okay, which is a lot of what I was opening this the talk with, that ethical dimension, this is now dealing with reality that is actually greater than being, because it's not reductive. No matter how much you try to pin it down, there's always more. My argument about teleological suspensions of disciplinarity, that argument is actually the same argument. Patricia has a question, but before your question comes, Patricia, let me just read out LaRose's, because LaRose said, Lewis, would you elaborate on Afro-pessimist's incomplete reading of Fanon's formulation of the Black person's negative ontological existence in relation to the white person? I can do that very quickly, and then we go to Patricia. The short answer is they don't understand what the zone of non-being is. The error they make is that they think humanity is being, but actually humanity is connected to existence. And existence, in fact, even etymologically, means to stand out. So what humanity actually is a divergence from being. And so the narcissistic rage, why Black people, as an example, or indigenous peoples, and many others, depending on the context, create narcissistic rage, is because they remind the hegemonic, the dominant group, that if they're really human beings, it means that they're not a closed being. And if you're not a closed being, it means you're open to a relationship with others, the other. And there's an even deeper psychoanalytical work in that. I recommend the work of Barnaby Barrett, because he argues that this leads to a multitude of converging normative concerns. And among them, and this is very crucial, a lot of us don't realize that communication, language is also erotic. And it's erotic because if you think about it, it means the other is simultaneously out there and inside of you. And you carry the other in you, but not in the sense of a vessel. It's because in genuine communication, there's always intimacy. And that's what they miss when they use their model of ontology. In other words, they don't realize the distinction between being and existence. So go ahead, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Lewis. That was just wonderful with lots to digest. Like others, I really like the Frankenstein analysis and the distinction between reproduction and creation, and also underscoring the extreme narcissism of what emerged out of colonialism. With that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the social self and what kind of proxies, how we articulate the proxies that might need to go with that. And I think this was really underlined some of my questions before. So, you know, in really basic terms, the neoliberal individual is sort of in space like a container, right? It's that model. And that is the way that we kind of operate at professional gatherings and department meetings. You know, people like show up, and I think that generates that agano model that you're talking about, where then heads come in. The presumption is that we're all in that space in the same way. And we know through all these phenomenological analyses of race and sex and sexuality that we're not all in those spaces. And those spaces are warped and textured, and they're not just kind of this flat container. So if we just leave, you know, that model of the individual and all its underlying issues of space and agonistic methods and move to a social self. You know, I'm a student of Buddhism nowadays and Buddhist philosophy. Well, there are different Buddhist schools, but I think it's safe to say, you know, that Buddhism kind of anticipated socially constructed notions of the self centuries before we had these kind of contemporary concepts. And that means that it's adherent to a social conception of the self that emerges only in the nexes of relationships of every kind. And of course, it's not static and not a one-time permanent thing. I mention this because in Buddhism, there's still a history of teaching to the individual, literally in the sanghas and the communities, meditation practices for liberation and awakening, that actually still circumvents exploration of those erotic and power dynamics that run between people and groups. So even in the tradition of socially engaged Buddhism, we like to credit Thich Nhat Hanh with that. And we know Thich Nhat Hanh worked with Martin Luther King and that he actually made Buddhism political. But even he, if you read 95% of his books are all about resolving anger and rage and all these things internal to the individual, or at best interpersonal relationships. And so I think that sociogenic element falls out of the picture. So, I think this is where a kind of decolonial lens is really important, even when looking wherever, in Western Buddhisms, Asian Buddhisms. I would like to, I wonder how you think about this. I think you're doing it. I think it's really important to articulate the need for interspaces, interrace, intersex, all of it as the spaces within which we come to reflexivity. We see ourselves mirrored, good and bad. We open up to discovery. New meanings we can't anticipate emerge. What would it mean to think about educational models in a way that really, so I'm saying it's not enough to say the individual is social, but you got to really get to the social foundations of how we think about education and praxis. I think your final model is a model of this, but I'm just wondering whether you want to, on the debate side, how can you even judge the rationality of your position if others aren't real to you in any reasonably rich way? And so what are those between spaces where first we become more real to one another as the basis out of which then we might think about political action, political aims, any things of that kind? I wonder what you have to say about that.
Sure. Well, several things. The first thing, of course, is it's good that you didn't bring up American Buddhism, because American Buddhism is hilarious. A lot of American Buddhists say, I'm a Buddhist, I'm trying to find myself. And then the moment they say this, you say, you don't understand Buddhism.
Okay, but can I interject? Because I think we have a Black Buddhist tradition in the United States.
Yes.
As they say, we've been here all along. We've heard that kind of phrase before. And, they're unknown, right? They're not right. They're unknown in this large field of mindfulness, where even mindfulness is commodity. It's true. We don't, I'm not going all the way into that, but it is one of the issues in the background of my thinking. The Black Buddhists are really clear, the Black Buddhist groups, that two streams of ancestors come together in them, right? The Dharma traditions out of Buddhism and civil rights. And these two intermix to produce really what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's not only there, it's in some other forms. For instance, a lot of people would be surprised to find out that there is, at a certain level of argumentation, a convergence between someone like Levinas and Maulana Karenga, who's known more as an Afrocentric thinker. And the reason there's a convergence of the two is because, as we know, that Levinas raises the question of the ethical. And a lot of people, one big problem is there are a lot of Christian readings of Levinas, and they miss the Jewish dimensions of his thought. Because in Judaism, the whole question of being responsible for responsibility, that's the radical ethical dimension of the thought. But as we know with Levinas, because he still works within the framework of liberalism, he radicalizes the other in such a way that the other is not socially rich. Whereas in Maulana Karenga, looking at all of the things around him, he sees the ethical call as going thickly into the social world and the historicality and the politicality of that situation.
Okay.
Now, if we go in terms of some of the Buddhist traditions, what's even more complicated there is we know there are those in Buddhism who actually move into, strangely enough, a form of asceticism.
Yeah, I know.
And I have a lot of problems with asceticism. I see asceticism as actually a form of passive-aggressive narcissism. But the more complicated kind, and I think one of the most sophisticated examples in Zen Buddhism, particularly in terms of someone like Nishitani. And one of the reasons is because Nishitani begins to, what Nishitani does that is absolutely brilliant, is that Nishitani looks at the question of Dharma, but he looks at also a lot of other concepts like shunyata and other concepts. For those of you who are wondering what the hell we're talking about how one deals with the question of absence, emptiness. In other words, that which is not identical with being, okay? And one of the things that Nishitani points out is that there's a reason that a lot of Western thought collapses into a form of theodicy. Because once one deals with the being of God, then one has to deal with what must be outside of God. But because Nishitani, takes the position that once you have that investment, notions of the self, and especially the self without the connection to the elements of openness, those notions of the self are locked in not only the metaphysics of substance, but they also become, he argues, the source of evil, because the whole point of evil is to close off the possibility of flourishing. And so within that framework, but when he says flourishing, he doesn't mean flourishing in the sense of a preordained order of flourishing.
Right.
And this is where it comes to another element that I think is really an exciting period. You know, one of the things right now, for instance, a lot of people are talking about trans discourses. And if you look back at my argument around disciplinary decadence, some people say, oh, so you're defending interdisciplinarity, the communication of disciplines. And I would say, no, I'm actually defending transdisciplinarity. Because as we know, the thing about trans is that if it's going to transcend the notion of an ontological reduction, it means the possibilities are manifold. And so trans means different forms of life could come into being, but each of them could be in a relation to what we're doing. So those erotic dimensions and those other dimensions I'm talking about, those are actually linked more to the trans and erotic dimensions of communication itself. And this also informs a lot of the ways we look at language, because we know in a lot of philosophy of language, is ultimately premised upon metaphors of substance, control, and order. But one of the things about language is that language does more than, it's not just simply about knowing language or learning language. It's also language is a productive activity through which, as meanings grow, new kinds of relationships grow as well. So yeah, and let's see, Sandra says, thank you very much for, how do I imagine myself away from narcissism, continue in non-narcissistic ways through theory and otherwise, while still being able to catch myself when I'm narcissistic? Well, that's more the epistemological formulation. The short answer is don't worry about that. Actually, the short answer, in other words, if you have to work at not being a narcissist, you become a narcissist. The thing it seems to be that's very different is to think about others more, to be really connected to the fact that there are people in the world. A good example is there are people whose main concern is what's going to happen to me. But if you're at a point at which you are listening to others, you're relating to others, you're learning from others, and you understand that you're in a learning community, a world with others, then at that moment, the question becomes not whether you're a narcissist. The question becomes what kind of actions are actually going on that will actually create better communities of communication, etc. Now, of course, there are times where one may discover things about oneself that one doesn't like. But the fact of the matter, and this is the difficult part of all intellectual work, of any kind of work that one does, one has to be able to face what in psychoanalysis is the most difficult challenge. And the most difficult challenge, what many psychoanalysts would tell you, of course, is to face your relationship to your actions, to what you do. And one of the biggest fears of all narcissism is truth. But when I say truth, of course, I don't mean it simply as correspondence truth, which is a more ontological notion. I mean truth as an ongoing relationship and work and practice of having ourselves in relationship with reality. And this is one of the reasons why when people ask, what's your work about? I often say, my work is about human beings' relationship with reality and the many ways we have of avoiding it. And our effort to avoid it, and this is what I brought up earlier with Nishitani Kaiji, this is what's insightful. Our ways of avoiding reality often leads to those Theodician elements. Okay, I think that's, Yoko.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yoko had to leave. It was 3 a.m.
Oh yeah. Okay, she was saying she had to leave. Okay.
Yeah. But
well, this will be
anyway.
recorded, so thank you, Yoko.
Yeah, that's right. It will be. So we probably ought to draw this to a close. I want to give Corey the final word on this, but I do want everybody to be aware that the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought is a not-for-profit organization. If you find it in your heart to send us a check, then I would appreciate it. You can go to our website and find out how to do that. If you don't want to do that, that's just fine. We'll hang in there. So, Corey, let me turn it over to you.
I don't have much to add. I just want to thank all of our speakers for an amazing day of talks and conversation. So much to think about, and I want to thank everybody else for thinking and conversing with us. So,
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you, Corey. And to everybody, keep safe, healthy, and as I say these days, despite the difficult times, and boy, we're going to face it in November, despite all that, do find moments of joy. It reminds you you're a human being. It reminds you about life. And it's one of the best ways in which to remember that what's the point of life if you're not trying to live a life worth living? And that life should be one you enjoy. So wishing you all safety, health, and joy.